13 is not an age for coronations in the body, yet a child is pressed into the ancient service of lineage. The room is cold, the candles tremble. The snow outside insists on silence that the chamber refuses. The girl is Margaret Beaufort. She is small. She is not finished growing. Her bones argue with the task. Midwives move with practiced calm. They speak little. They know the risk. They know that the womb can be a battlefield before the crown is ever forged. The physician watches and measures what he cannot command. He counts breath and pulse in his head and prays while pretending not to pray. A labor that should be natural becomes a negotiation with physics. The pelvis is narrow. The child is large. The angle is wrong. The room fills with herbs and whispers, oil and linen and water and fear. The body remembers that it is a child even while it is asked to be a mother. Pain is not a metaphor here. It is a policy. The policy is cruel. It belongs to a century that treats girls as guarantors of treaties. We like to say that dynasties are made on battlefields. That is only half the truth. They are also made on beds where a child clenches blood-soaked sheets and tries not to die. The midwives adapt. They shift the body. They coax the hidden head. They talk to the mother as if she were older than the world. She is brave because no option is available. She is quiet because breath must be saved for what is coming. Time stretches. Hours become a geography instead of a count. The walls keep the sound. The castle learns a new kind of echo. There is a point when even the strongest doubt. The physician considers an operation that would save the child and bury the mother. He does not choose it. He waits. He listens. He lets skill and fortune and stubborn life test each other. The child inside fights. The mother outside fights. Their struggles are not equal and not separate. There is finally a moment that is not a decision, but a surrender. The body opens enough. The head crowns. The room holds its breath. The baby arrives with a thin cry that sounds like an argument won. The midwives move fast. They clear the mouth. They rub small limbs. They give the child to heat and cloth. They return the child to a brief meeting on a wounded chest. The mother stares as if memorizing a map that she will need to cross later. She will cross it many times. Blood loss follows. Shock follows. The physician mutters about torn flesh and torn futures. He is right. She will never bear another child. The cost is immediate and permanent. It is also political. A single birth has just created an heir and ended a line. A girl has made a king and sacrificed a kingdom in her own body. Historians often call this destiny. That word hides the labor. It hides the stitches and the fever and the sleepless nights when breath rattles like loose coins. It hides the terror of touch that may remain for years. It hides the quiet faith that becomes a structure when the body fails. The truth is simpler and harder. A child was forced to do an adult job because men needed a symbol. She did it and lived. She did it and paid. The baby will be Henry VII. The dynasty will be Tudor. The war will end later, and we will praise the settlement. We will praise policy and marriage and clever generals. We will teach dates and names and banners. We will quote speeches. We will rarely put words to this room. We will rarely tell students that a future of laws and palaces began with a girl who could barely walk without pain. Yet the record is plain enough for anyone who looks. The first victory of that reign was not at Bosworth. It was here. It was won by a child who refused to die. The birth of Henry Tudor in the winter of the year 1457 was not a pageant. It was a cry. It was a room full of smoke from herbs and the smell of blood and sweat. The castle at Pembroke was a fortress against men, but not against the tearing of a girl's body. Margaret Beaufort was only 13 years old. She was slight and narrow. She'd been married too young and widowed even younger. Now she lay on a bed that became an altar for dynastic ambition. The midwives had seen many births, but they had never seen such youth pressed to the edge of death. They prayed as they worked. The physician, with all his learning and books from Oxford and Paris, felt helpless. He knew bones and angles. He knew when nature resisted will. He knew that this child might end with silence. Hours passed. Each one was long as a campaign. Margaret's voice grew hoarse until it broke into whispers and then gasps. She held the sheets as if they could carry her away. Outside, the sea struck the rocks. Inside, time bent around a single moment. The body of the girl became battlefield and temple at once. She was the vessel of a hope larger than herself. At last, the infant came. The midwife drew him into the cold air, and for a breath the chamber waited. His skin was pale, his chest still, his eyes closed. Then came the sound. A thin wail, a proof of life. The women moved quickly to clean him and warm him. They placed him on the mother's chest for a heartbeat of contact. Margaret looked at the child with eyes that memorized him, as if she feared to forget. She was too weak to hold him long. Her body was broken. She had given all that could be given. The physician whispered that she would never bear another child. That fact was already history in the making. For the baby who cried on that winter night was the last chance of a house in ruin. He was Henry Tudor. He was the fragile thread on which a dynasty would be woven. His father was dead. His mother was half alive. His uncle Jasper guarded the walls. Outside, England split between roses of red and white. The child knew none of this. He only knew warmth and milk and the sound of breathing beside him. Yet in that small cry, the wars of the roses had already shifted. Not on a field of battle, but in the bed of a child mother. Historians like to speak of destiny. They call this boy a founder and a unifier. That may be true, but it hides the raw beginning. He began as blood on stone floors. He began as fear in a chapel. He began as risk calculated by men who cared more for crowns than for the girl who bled for it. He was not born in triumph. He was born in survival. Margaret recovered slowly. She carried scars in body and spirit that shaped her faith and her will. Her son was her only treasure and her only weapon. She poured into him the ambitions she could no longer carry in her own flesh. Henry grew in exile, but his first exile was from the safe womb his mother could not provide. His first victory was to breathe. The dynasty of Tudor began with that breath. It was the softest sound, yet it echoed louder than cannon. It promised change in a land of war. It promised the end of one conflict and the beginning of another. It promised that a girl's pain would not be forgotten, but transformed into a kingdom. The birth of Henry Tudor was not a miracle. It was a negotiation with death that ended with life. It was the beginning of a reign not yet imagined. It was the moment when history turned in silence before anyone could name it. The death of John Beaufort in the year 1444 was not only the end of a man, but also the shaping of a destiny for his infant daughter, Margaret. He was the first Duke of Somerset and had carried the weight of failed campaigns in France. He had marched with pride under banners that once belonged to Henry V, and he had returned with shame after those banners were lowered. The 100 Years' War had eaten at him. Each defeat was more than lost ground. It was a wound in his mind. He had seen towns surrendered and soldiers scattered. He had seen the enemy grow stronger as England grew weaker. When he returned to court, people whispered. They saw the hollow eyes. They noticed the trembling hands. They marked how little he spoke and how little he ate. He had once been a noble figure, tall and commanding. Now he moved like a shadow. Some said he drank poison. Others said he took a blade to himself. The official word was fever. The truth is not written. What is written is that he was found dead at Wimborne Minster on the 27th of May. He was young. He left behind a baby girl and a widow who understood the dangers of noble blood without strong protection. His death was more than personal loss. It was political instability. In a world where lineage meant power, his absence left Margaret exposed. She was 1 year old. She had no memory of his face. She had no sense of his despair. Yet his despair shaped her life. The court had little patience for weakness. Defeat was treated like disease. Failure was feared like infection. Men who lost wars lost more than battles. They lost honor. They lost trust. Sometimes they lost their lives. For John Beaufort, the weight of military disaster was heavier than armor. He had been sent to hold the line in France. Instead, he watched as it broke. He carried the shame of retreat. He carried the whispers of betrayal. To live in that atmosphere was to live already condemned. His sudden death fit too neatly into the pattern of noble misfortune. Perhaps it was illness. Perhaps it was poison by rivals. Perhaps it was the silence of a man who could no longer bear the sound of his own failure. Historians argue, but the fact remains that Margaret grew up with a ghost. Her father's story was told to her in fragments. He was noble, he was doomed, he was remembered more for his fall than for his rise. That memory became a warning. It told her that power was fragile. It told her that survival was not given, it was taken. The shadow of his death hung over her childhood. It also gave her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, the chance to prove her own skill. The Dowager Duchess secured new alliances. She moved her daughter like a piece on a board. She understood that the loss of a husband did not mean the loss of a future, yet she also knew that whispers of poison and disgrace would cling to her family. Margaret was born into those whispers. They were her lullaby. They were the first lesson. The lesson was that honor could be stripped away by defeat, and life could be stripped away by rumor. The death of John Beaufort was not only the end of a man, but the beginning of the steel that would grow in his daughter. She learned through his absence. She learned that trust was rare. She learned that safety was never permanent. She learned that the world judged weakness harshly. That childhood without a father was also a childhood with a warning. The dynasty that she would later build began in that absence. It began with the silence of a father who could not endure. It began with the fragility of life in a court where loyalty shifted like sand. The death of John Beaufort is often marked as a date on a line. It was more than that. It was the first test for a girl who would become the mother of kings. The story of Margaret Beaufort begins not with her choices, but with contracts written before she could read. She was 6 years old when she was first promised in marriage. The groom was John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. It was a union of families rather than of children. The girl played in gardens. The boy grew under tutors, yet parchment already bound them tighter than affection ever could. In 15th century England, marriages were weapons. They joined bloodlines. They secured lands. They ended feuds. They created alliances that might outlast battles. A child became valuable not for laughter or learning, but for the reach of her kin. Margaret's betrothal was arranged to hold together power across noble houses. Her father was dead. Her mother understood that security came only from contracts. The papers signed in halls weighed more than prayers in chapels. For a few years the arrangement seemed firm. The names of Beaufort and Suffolk carried strength. But politics never rested. In 1450, the Duke of Suffolk fell. His career collapsed after peace with France brought rage at home. He was accused of treason. He was accused of betrayal. His enemies dragged him from a ship and struck his head with a dull blade. The execution was clumsy and cruel. The sea swallowed his body. His fall ruined the promise made for Margaret. The betrothal became nothing but wasted ink. For her, it was the first lesson that alliances were fragile. Paper could not protect when blood was spilled. She was still a child, yet she was already reshaped by events she could not control. Nobility in that century meant living in the shadow of shifting loyalty. Margaret saw how quickly honor turned to ruin. She also saw how a girl could be passed like coin from hand to hand. Another contract would come, another marriage would be forged. Her value was in her blood. She carried the line of John of Gaunt. That made her prize and danger at once. Each suitor was not a boy or a man, but a banner. Each proposal was a gamble. Behind every feast and vow stood questions of power. For Margaret, the years of childhood were filled not with dolls, but with negotiations. Her future was not to be chosen, it was to be calculated. When Suffolk died and his plans dissolved, she was quickly reassigned. Her mother wasted no time. In noble society, hesitation was death. The loss of one match only meant the search for another. That search was cold but practical. Margaret grew up in this climate. She learned early that affection had little place in marriage. She learned that survival required obedience, but also attention. She watched. She listened. She began to understand that the same system that bound her could also be studied. Later, she would use that knowledge. Later, she would make contracts of her own. But at 6, she was simply a child with a fate written by others. This was the pattern of her life. Each shift in politics changed the name of her husband. Each death or disgrace redrew the map of her future. To call it childhood is almost a mistake. It was apprenticeship in survival. The betrothal to John de la Pole is remembered now as a failed match. But it was more than that. It was the opening chapter in the education of a strategist. It showed her that alliances were temporary. It showed her that even powerful dukes could be destroyed. It showed her that promises in noble courts were as fragile as glass, that fragility would mark her decisions for decades. The child who once held hands in gardens would become a woman who held kingdoms in her plans. The first step was taken when she was 6, with a contract she could not read and a future she could not yet imagine. The marriage of Margaret Beaufort to Edmund Tudor in the year 1455 was not a romance, but a calculation. She was 12 years old. He was more than 20. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, where her childhood had been spent. The great hall was dressed with tapestries of ancestors, and the chapel held the tombs of the dead. Words of love were spoken, but they were not hers. They were formulas of alliance. The vows were binding, and the girl was bound. In that world, a noble daughter was not protected by her age. She was judged ready when politics required her body. Edmund Tudor was half-brother to King Henry VI. His claim to status came from his mother, Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, who had secretly married Owen Tudor. The blood was questioned by some, the legitimacy was doubted. Yet the king favored his half-brothers and gave them titles. Edmund became Earl of Richmond, and with this title he took Margaret as wife. For him the union meant estates and influence. For her, it meant the end of childhood. The wedding feast was filled with ceremony. There was music. There was prayer. There were smiles that masked the bargain. That night the marriage was made physical. Margaret was still small. She was still growing. There was no pause to wait for her body to catch her spirit. The act was a wound. It left her with damage that would mark her life. She never spoke of it later. She carried the memory in silence. Within months, her belly grew. Her attendants whispered with both hope and fear. They knew what it meant. They knew what it risked. A 12-year-old girl was not meant to bear the weight of an heir, yet that was her charge. She moved through corridors with the stiffness of someone carrying both life and death. Her mother watched with worry. She had been older when she gave birth and had survived. She saw the danger in the youth of her daughter, but nothing could change it. The contract was sealed. The child within was the seed of a future. Edmund did not live to see that child. He went to Wales to fight in the struggle between Lancaster and York. He was captured at Carmarthen. His death came in the year 1456. The cause was uncertain. Some said plague, some said murder, some said betrayal by his own men. The truth was clouded. What is clear is that Margaret was left a widow before she was 13. She was pregnant and alone. Her husband gone, her family's future placed in her body. She was brought under the care of Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother. He took her to Pembroke Castle. There she faced the trial of labor that nearly killed her. From this union came Henry Tudor, who would become king. The marriage itself lasted less than a year. It was a brief episode measured in contracts, in war, and in a single birth. Yet, it shaped history. It ended the girlhood of Margaret. It set the stage for a dynasty. It taught her that alliances could be deadly. It showed her that politics had no mercy for the young. When historians trace the rise of the Tudors, they speak of battles and banners. They often forget this quiet marriage. But it was here that the line was secured. It was here that sacrifice was demanded. It was here that a girl was made into the mother of a king. The death of Edmund Tudor in the autumn of the year 1456 was not only the loss of a husband, but the collapse of a fragile shield around a child bride. He had gone to Wales to secure the cause of Lancaster against the rising strength of York. He was young, but seasoned by war. He carried the title of Earl of Richmond and the burden of family ambition. His wife, Margaret Beaufort, was 12 years old and already pregnant with his child. Their union had been short and harsh. Now the war demanded his service. He moved with his men into Carmarthen Castle. The walls there were thick and the air damp. The conflict was a tangle of raids and loyalties that shifted by the day. At some point, Edmund was taken prisoner. How it happened remains unclear. Some accounts say he was surprised in the field, others whisper of betrayal within his own company. He was placed in confinement, and the weeks that followed are wrapped in shadow. The official word was that he died of plague. Disease was common in the prisons of the time. The story was convenient. It explained his swift decline. It spared his captors the stain of royal blood on their hands. But chroniclers noted how sudden his death came. They noted how no physician was allowed to attend him. They suspected that the sickness was a mask for murder. If he was poisoned or struck down, no proof survives. What survives is the effect. By November, Edmund was dead. He had been married for less than a year. He left behind no estate secured, no victories won, no lasting mark on the wars he fought. He left behind only a widow, not yet 13 years old, carrying his heir. Margaret received the news at Lamphy Palace, where she had been waiting in prayer for her husband's safe return. The messenger rode through storm and mud to bring the words. She was in the chapel when he entered. She understood before he spoke. The silence was heavier than the rain outside. In that moment she knew that her world had been broken. The loss was not only personal, it was political. Edmund's death left the Tudor claim fragile. It left the Beaufort girl unprotected in a realm splitting apart. She had no husband. She had no guardian save the younger brother of the dead man. Jasper Tudor stepped into that role. He was in his 20s and already hardened by struggle. He understood that the unborn child in Margaret's womb was the hope of his line. He carried her to Pembroke Castle for safety. The castle stood high above the waters of Milford Haven. It was stone against storm. Within those walls, she would endure a birth that nearly killed her. The death of Edmund Tudor marked the beginning of her isolation. She had entered marriage with no understanding of choice. She left it with scars and responsibility far beyond her years. The wars that raged across England made her position more dangerous. A widow with an heir was both prize and target. Enemies would watch, allies would scheme. Her life became a calculation of survival. Historians often write of Edmund as a shadow. He died too early to leave a legacy of deeds. Yet his death mattered because it shaped the woman who would fight for their child. It forced her to grow into resolve while still a girl. It showed her that promises of protection could vanish overnight. It taught her that faith and strategy were the only defenses she could claim. Edmund Tudor's death was not glorious. It was not remembered with songs or monuments. It was quiet, doubtful, and unresolved. But it was the spark that turned Margaret from pawn into player. It set her on the path to guard the life of her son. That son would one day wear the crown. The birth of Henry Tudor in the winter of the year 1457 at Pembroke Castle was one of the most brutal episodes of survival in the history of England. Margaret Beaufort was 13 years old. She was a widow. She was a child carrying a child. The castle stood high on limestone cliffs above the waters of Milford Haven. Its great round keep had endured storms and sieges for centuries, but it was never meant to shelter a girl in such torment. The winter was harsh. Ice clung to the windows. The sea wind roared through the cracks in the stone walls. Fires blazed in the hearths, yet gave little warmth. Margaret's body was small. Her hips were narrow. Her frame was not ready for the weight it carried. The physician Louis Caerleon examined her with grave concern. He knew the angles were wrong. He knew the chances were poor. He whispered to Jasper Tudor that the labor might kill both mother and child. The midwives prepared. They had knives for cords. They had hooks for desperate measures. They burned herbs for calm. They prayed in Latin. They sang soft words in Welsh. Margaret walked the battlements in the days before to build her strength. When the first pains struck, she bent double. She was carried to her chamber lit by candles and tapestries hung to block the cold. The labor began with screams that echoed in the halls. Hours passed. Her voice broke. She was left with gasps that sounded more like the breath of animals than of humans. The midwives worked. They turned her body. They massaged her belly. They gave her potions of rosemary and lavender. They tried to guide the child, but the body resisted. The head was lodged. The blood flowed. The girl weakened. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel and prayed without ceasing. Jasper Tudor paced outside the chamber with boots striking the stones like a drum. He knew that his family's hope was within that room. He could do nothing but listen to the cries that tore through his chest. Inside, Dame Gwen, the head midwife, used every trick she knew. She pressed, she pulled, she whispered prayers, she called on the patron saint of childbirth, she tried to save both. The night stretched into day. Margaret's skin was pale as parchment, her pulse thinned, her eyes rolled with fever. The physician feared she would die. The decision was made to attempt a manual extraction. It was dangerous. It had killed many before. Yet it was the only chance. The midwife reached within with steady hands. She pulled with strength earned from decades of practice. At last, the infant slid into the world, limp and covered in blood. For a moment there was silence. The fire cracked. The wind howled. Margaret breathed faintly. Then a thin cry broke the air. It was weak but alive. The room filled with relief. The child was wrapped and placed upon the broken chest of his mother. She opened her eyes long enough to see him. She memorized his face with desperate love. She was too weak to hold him. The damage was permanent. Her body was torn. She would never again bear children. The victory was not without cost. The girl who had entered the chamber would never be whole. She hovered for weeks between life and death. Fevers burned. Nightmares haunted her. She recoiled from touch, yet she lived. The child lived. Henry Tudor's first breath was a triumph of endurance rather than of fate. It was born in blood and fire. It was born in the cries of a girl forced to be a mother. Historians often speak of Bosworth Field as the moment of Tudor triumph. In truth, the first victory was here. It was in Pembroke Castle when Margaret Beaufort refused to die and gave England a king. The consequence of Margaret Beaufort's childbirth in the winter of the year 1457 was more than pain and more than memory. It was the permanent end of her ability to bear children. She was 13 years old when her body was torn. The physician Louis Caerleon examined her in the days that followed. He spoke in quiet tones about the damage. Flesh had split. Organs were injured. The blood loss had been heavy. Infection threatened her life for weeks. The fevers came and went. The midwives spooned broth between her lips. They prayed as they worked. She lingered between life and death. But she lived. Yet her body was no longer whole. The verdict was certain. She would never again carry a child. That truth shaped everything that followed. In an age when noble women were valued for fertility, Margaret had only one son to offer. Henry was her single gift to dynasty. She poured into him the weight of all her ambition and all her love. The absence of future children became the foundation of her relentless focus. Her body was broken, but her spirit sharpened. She understood that survival meant strategy. She could not give England many heirs. She could give England one. That one would have to be enough. Historians often describe this as a misfortune. It was more than misfortune. It was transformation. The injury forced her to abandon the traditional path of medieval noblewomen. She would never retreat into repeated childbirths and domestic obscurity. She would instead build power with her mind and her will. She studied, she prayed, she planned. Her barrenness gave her clarity. Every choice she made turned toward the protection of Henry. She bargained marriages, she managed estates, she learned law and finance, she created networks of loyalty and secrecy. The wound of her youth became the steel of her maturity. Yet the cost was real. She lived with pain. She lived with the fear of touch. She lived with nights haunted by screams that were her own. Her body bore the marks of survival rather than triumph. When she knelt in chapels for hours, bleeding on her knees, it was both piety and penance. She sought meaning in suffering. She sought purpose in loss. The church gave her language for what had no language. She prayed to saints of childbirth, though she would never give birth again. She prayed for her son who had taken so much from her. She prayed for the endurance to make his life worth her sacrifice. People at court called her devout. They called her holy. They did not always see that her religion was also memory. Every candle she lit was a memorial for the girl who had almost died. Every fast she kept was a discipline against despair. The inability to bear more children did not lessen her importance. It heightened it. Henry's survival became urgent. If he died, her line died. If he lived, she could rise with him. This truth made her vigilant. She watched every move in politics. She read every sign of danger. She created one of the most effective intelligence networks of her age. Her barrenness gave her the time and the focus to master such arts. The chronicles record her later as the king's mother, the Lady Margaret, the foundress of colleges, the patron of scholars. Yet behind all of that was the young girl who had been shattered by a single birth. Behind every act of power was the body that could never repeat the act that had destroyed it. The dynasty of Tudor was built not on abundance, but on scarcity. It was built on the survival of one mother and one son. It was built on the knowledge that no second chance would come. That knowledge made Margaret Beaufort relentless. It made her unyielding. It made her into the woman who guarded her only child until he took the crown. The religious fervor of Margaret Beaufort was not an ornament of character, but a survival strategy born from trauma. She was 13 when her body was broken by childbirth at Pembroke Castle. She was left barren. She was left in pain. She was left with a memory of screams that would not leave her. In that silence after agony, she turned to faith. She did not turn lightly. She turned with obsession. She prayed for hours. She prayed until her knees bled on the chapel floor. She memorized psalms in Latin. She whispered the names of saints. She read scripture with the hunger of a scholar. She read theology with the discipline of a monk. Her attendants worried as she starved herself in fasts. They worried as she kept vigils in cold stone chapels while others slept. They worried as she turned her body into a sacrifice because she had already been sacrificed once. For Margaret, religion was not fashion. It was not display. It was a structure to contain suffering. It gave her language for wounds that could not be spoken in court. It gave her purpose when her role as wife and mother had been shattered. Historians often paint her as pious to the point of severity. That is true, but severity was her shield. Her devotion kept her mind fixed when fear of loss could have broken her. She had one son. She had one chance. She believed that God had spared her for that mission. She saw herself as chosen. She saw herself as an instrument. She acted with the certainty of one who believed her suffering had meaning. Faith became discipline. Discipline became power. She studied the writings of the fathers of the church. She learned the art of confession and the weight of penance. She treated every act of politics as if it were also an act of prayer. When she bargained for estates, she saw stewardship. When she wrote letters in code, she saw providence. When she endured insult, she saw trial. Her faith was not retreat, it was armor, it was also influence. Clergy saw in her a patron. Monks saw in her a supporter. Scholars saw in her a benefactor. She gave money to colleges. She funded printing of texts. She built networks that were both spiritual and political. Her name spread not only in courts, but in monasteries and libraries. The prayers of others carried her cause as much as the swords of her allies. People who met her called her holy. They called her severe. They called her unbending. Yet those who looked closer saw a woman who had made faith serve ambition. The cross and the crown were joined in her mind. The altar and the council table were the same stage. Margaret prayed for her son's safety with the same intensity that she plotted for his throne. For her, the two aims were not separate. They were one. God had given her Henry. God had taken her body. God demanded that she make that child king. That belief never left her. It grew stronger as she grew older. Even when placed under house arrest, she prayed with the confidence of one who expected divine reversal. Even when her plots failed, she fasted and waited for Providence to turn. When Henry finally crossed the sea to claim his crown in the year 1485, she saw in it the proof of her lifelong conviction. Faith had not been decoration, it had been the foundation of strategy. The prayers of a girl in pain had become the policy of a mother in power. That is why her religious zeal matters. It was not only personal, it was political. It was the transformation of grief into authority. It was the means by which Margaret Beaufort turned her wounds into weapons and her faith into the throne of England. The second marriage of Margaret Beaufort was not guided by affection, but by political calculation. She was 14 years old when she gave birth to Henry at Pembroke Castle and nearly died. She was widowed before she was 13 when Edmund Tudor perished in captivity. She had one son who carried the fragile hope of the Lancastrian cause. That child was both blessing and burden. He gave her purpose but placed her in danger. In a land torn by the wars of the roses, a young widow with a potential heir was a target. She needed protection. She needed alliance. In the year 1458, she married Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The ceremony was quiet. There was no pageantry of kings or feasts of triumph. It was a contract made in careful terms. Margaret was still weak from her ordeal. Her body carried scars that never healed. Her spirit carried fear, but also resolve. Stafford was not a grand match. He was not close to the throne, yet he offered stability. He offered soldiers. He offered the name of Buckingham, which could shield her and her son. For Margaret, this was not a marriage of passion. It was a fortress. It was a shield. The Dowager Duchess, her mother, helped negotiate every clause. They insisted that her Beaufort estates remain under her control. They insisted that her son Henry remain under the care of Jasper Tudor in Wales. They secured promises that her inheritance would not be swallowed into the Stafford holdings. Every detail was written with the caution of people who knew that fortune turned quickly. The arrangement worked. Margaret was protected. Stafford kept his household in order. He was a Yorkist sympathizer, but he was also pragmatic. He knew that protecting his wife meant preserving valuable land and lineage. Margaret adapted. She lived beside a man who stood with York while her blood tied her to Lancaster. She kept her words measured. She kept her thoughts guarded. She watched and she learned. She saw how politics required compromise. She saw how survival sometimes meant walking with the enemy. She practiced the art of silence and the art of patience. For 14 years, she remained Stafford's wife. Those years were not filled with love songs. They were filled with calculation. She visited courts. She managed estates. She built networks of women who shared letters and secrets across the lines of battle. She corresponded with Elizabeth Woodville, Queen to Edward IV, while also keeping ties with Margaret of Anjou in exile. It was a balancing act that required skill and nerve. A single word could have meant treason. A single letter could have meant death. Yet, she maintained her position. Stafford himself was wounded at the Battle of Edgecote in the year 1469. The injury left him weakened and bitter. Margaret cared for him with patience, but she also used the time to bend his loyalty. She spoke of the failures of Edward IV. She spoke of the corruption she saw. She did not urge rebellion directly. She planted doubts. She fed his disappointment. Gradually, his loyalties shifted. By the time of Warwick's rebellion in the year 1470, Stafford was ready to reconsider his allegiance. This was the fruit of Margaret's quiet labor. Her marriage had begun as protection. It became a field of influence. It showed her that politics could be managed not only in council halls, but in households. It taught her the slow art of persuasion. It gave her the patience she would later use to place her son on the throne. When Stafford died in the year 1471, Margaret was again widowed. Yet this time she was stronger. She had estates secure. She had networks established. She had practiced the art of surviving under enemy rule. Her second marriage had not brought her joy, but it had brought her safety and training. It had been a school for strategy. It had been a shield for her son. It had been a lesson in how to endure. The long separation between Margaret Beaufort and her son Henry Tudor was one of the most painful yet formative elements of her life. When Henry was born at Pembroke Castle in the winter of the year 1457, she was 13 years old and broken in body. She loved the child with the fierce desperation of a mother who had nearly died to give him life. Yet she soon saw that she could not keep him near. The Wars of the Roses had already begun. England was split between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. Henry was an heir of Lancaster through his mother's Beaufort blood and through his Tudor father. That made him valuable. That made him dangerous. Margaret's second marriage to Henry Stafford gave her protection, but her son was placed under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor in Wales. The reason was both practical and strategic. Wales offered safety in castles strong against siege. Jasper was loyal. Jasper was experienced. Margaret agreed, though her heart broke. She saw her son rarely. Some years she saw him once. Some years she did not see him at all. Each meeting was brief. Each parting was bitter. Henry grew from infant to boy, and then to youth under the eyes of his uncle rather than his mother. He learned Welsh. He learned riding and swordplay. He learned the loyalty of men in the hills. Margaret was not there to guide him. She guided through letters. She guided through gifts. She sent books with careful notes. She sent clothes sewn with her own hands. She wrote messages coded so that enemies could not read them. She poured into those letters the love she could not show in person. She prayed for his safety each day. She bribed servants for news. She built networks to hear whispers of his health. She lived in constant fear. She feared Yorkist soldiers would kill him. She feared plague would strike him. She feared betrayal by supposed friends. Each rumor was a wound. Each silence was torment. This separation lasted not months, but decades. In the year 1471, after the defeat at Tewkesbury, Henry fled into exile with Jasper. He was 14 years old. Margaret was left behind in England. She did not see him again for 14 years. She lived those years as if her heart were buried across the sea. She married Thomas Stanley for protection. She worked at court. She plotted quietly. But always her thoughts returned to her son. She imagined his face changing as he grew into manhood. She imagined his voice deepening. She imagined his hands holding the sword that might one day win him a crown. She clung to the hope that God had spared him for a purpose. The separation shaped her. It gave her patience. It gave her resolve. It gave her focus. She had no other children. She had no other cause. Henry was everything. Distance did not weaken her devotion. It sharpened it. Every plot she joined, every alliance she formed, every risk she took, all were for him. The mother became strategist because she had nothing else. The woman became relentless because she could not hold her child. When Henry finally returned to England in the year 1485, he was a grown man. Margaret had not seen him since he was a boy. Their reunion was filled with triumph, but also with the weight of lost years. She had missed his youth. She had missed his growing. She had missed the simple moments that bind mother and son. Yet her absence had not been without purpose. The long separation had forged in her a mind that thought like a soldier and a heart that endured like iron. It was this endurance that carried Henry to Bosworth. It was this endurance that built the Tudor throne. It was born not in presence, but in absence. It was born in the long years when a mother and son lived apart, yet never ceased to fight for each other. The transformation of Margaret Beaufort into a political player was not sudden, but steady and deliberate, born from necessity and sharpened by loss. She was a widow before she was 13. She was a mother before her body was grown. She was left barren after one brutal birth. She was a girl with estates, a son with acclaim, and enemies on all sides. At first, she was a pawn. She was passed between families through betrothals and marriages. She watched how alliances collapsed with a single death or disgrace. She listened to whispers of treason. She understood that survival required more than obedience. It required calculation. Her second marriage to Henry Stafford gave her safety and a chance to learn. She managed her estates. She read accounts and learned the language of law. She learned to weigh debts and favors. She learned to keep silent when silence was wise. She learned to use small gestures to win trust. She studied the politics of women as much as the politics of men. She wrote letters. She exchanged gifts. She created bonds across households. She saw that the networks of wives and mothers often lasted longer than the shifting loyalties of soldiers and lords. She practiced patience. She watched how Edward IV rose and fell, how Warwick the kingmaker turned against his own creation, how Henry VI was restored and then destroyed. She saw how crowns were gained not only on battlefields, but in councils and chambers. She survived by keeping one foot in York and one foot in Lancaster. She cultivated the Queen Elizabeth Woodville while sending secret messages to Margaret of Anjou. She walked a narrow line where one wrong word could bring her to the scaffold. Yet she did not fall. Each year her skill grew. Each year her reputation grew. People began to call her wise. People began to fear her silence. They began to see that she had the will of a statesman, though she was only a woman in a world that doubted female power. Her faith gave her a mask of piety. Behind that mask was a calculating mind. She prayed in chapels and fasted, but she also counted men and coin. She plotted marriages for allies. She studied the art of correspondence with codes and ciphers. She placed servants as informants in rival households. She built an intelligence web that reached from Wales to London and across the sea to Brittany, where her son lived in exile. She knew when armies were moving before some commanders knew. She knew who was in favor and who was in danger before the news reached the court. She did not command soldiers, she commanded information. In an age of swords, she wielded knowledge. That knowledge gave her power. When her second husband died in the year 1471, she faced the question of her future. She chose Thomas Stanley, a man who played politics with supreme skill. Their marriage was not for affection, it was for advantage. With Stanley, she gained military support and intelligence networks even wider than her own. Together, they formed a partnership where each gained by the strength of the other. From that point, Margaret was no longer merely surviving. She was playing. She moved pieces on the board of England with purpose. She plotted rebellions. She negotiated alliances. She prepared for the moment when her son would return. She had learned that politics was not only the domain of men with swords, it was also the art of patience, of secrecy, of endurance. By the time Henry Tudor landed in England in the year 1485, Margaret was already one of the most formidable political minds in the realm. Her transformation from pawn to player was complete. It had been forged in childhood marriages, in widowhood, in loss, in silence, and in unyielding faith. It made her the mother not only of a king, but of a dynasty. The third marriage of Margaret Beaufort to Thomas Stanley was not shaped by affection, but by the sharp edge of politics. She was approaching 30 years old when she made the choice. She had been twice widowed. She had endured the agony of a dangerous childbirth at 13 that left her barren. She had lived through the long separation from her son Henry, who was in exile across the sea. She had learned the arts of patience and intrigue. Now she needed power. She needed an alliance that could protect her estates, shield her name, and strengthen her cause. Thomas Stanley was the answer. He was one of the most skilled survivors of the Wars of the Roses. He was a man who had perfected the art of delay and decision. He shifted his loyalties at the last possible moment and always landed on the winning side. His family held great lands in the northwest. His retainers formed a private army. His networks reached into court, guilds, and counties. To marry him was to gain a fortress built of people rather than stone. For Stanley, marriage to Margaret was also gain. She brought the prestige of the Beaufort bloodline that tied directly to John of Gaunt. She brought estates that increased his influence. She brought connections that stretched across both Yorkist and Lancastrian circles. Each partner saw the advantage. Neither pretended it was romance. The wedding was marked with ceremony to display their joined importance. Nobles gathered, feasts were held, even King Edward IV attended. It was safer for him to watch Margaret than to leave her free in the shadows. The terms of the union were carefully written. Margaret retained control of her own estates. She retained her right to act for her son's interests. Stanley gained her alliance, but not her submission. They both knew the balance of the bargain. In daily life, the marriage worked as a partnership. Margaret used the cover of Stanley's power to build her networks further. She listened at court. She sent letters to exiles. She gathered intelligence through merchants, priests, and servants. Stanley gave her protection while pursuing his own policy of cautious neutrality. Together, they navigated the dangerous years after Edward IV died and Richard III seized the crown. When the young princes disappeared into the Tower, suspicion spread like fire. Richard was seen as a usurper and perhaps a child murderer. Margaret saw opportunity. She began to plan boldly for her son's return. She plotted with bishops. She plotted with exiles. She risked everything. Richard discovered her part in a failed rebellion in 1483. She was punished with house arrest and the loss of her titles, yet she survived because of Stanley. He interceded, he argued, he kept her alive. Margaret did not stop. Even confined, she continued to send messages through servants. She continued to calculate. She continued to believe. When her son landed in Wales in August of 1485, Stanley hesitated as always. He kept his forces near but withheld commitment. At Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, Richard III looked to Stanley for support. Stanley waited. He waited until the moment came. Then his men turned. Richard fell in battle. Henry Tudor was king. Margaret's long plan had reached its fulfillment. Her marriage to Stanley had given her the shield she needed to survive and the sword she needed at the final hour. It was not a marriage of love, but a marriage of power. It was the alliance that placed her son upon the throne. It proved that in the game of crowns, affection mattered little and strategy was all. Margaret Beaufort had chosen well. The triumph of Margaret Beaufort and the rise of the Tudor dynasty was the result of decades of pain, patience, and calculation rather than sudden fortune. She was 13 when she nearly died giving birth to Henry at Pembroke Castle. She was left barren and scarred. She was widowed twice before she was 30. She lived through exile, suspicion, and house arrest. She plotted in shadows and prayed in chapels. She endured separation from her only child for 14 years. Every loss became a lesson. Every wound became a weapon. When Henry Tudor landed in Wales in August of the year 1485, Margaret's lifetime of preparation moved toward its end. She had built alliances with bishops and nobles. She had planted her influence in court and household. She had secured the loyalty of Thomas Stanley, whose forces waited at Bosworth Field. On the 22nd of August, Richard III died in battle. His crown was found on the field and placed upon Henry's head. Margaret's son was now Henry VII. Her gamble had succeeded. Her long vigil had been rewarded. Yet her triumph was not merely the coronation of a son. It was the birth of a dynasty that would alter England and the world. Henry married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. The union of Lancaster and York ended the wars that had torn the realm apart for 30 years. It was the joining of red rose and white rose into the single emblem of Tudor. It was peace forged from blood. Margaret lived to see this union. She lived to see the birth of grandchildren. She lived to see the security of succession. She lived to see her son build a strong monarchy out of ruins. She was not content to fade into the background. She took the title of My Lady the King's Mother. She retained her estates. She retained her influence. She acted as advisor to Henry. She sponsored scholars. She founded colleges at Cambridge. She funded the printing of books. She shaped the church as well as the crown. Her piety was visible in every chapel she built and every prayer she kept. Her discipline was visible in every policy her son enacted. She was not queen, but she was more than queen. She was the architect behind the throne. She had begun life as a pawn, married off at 12, widowed at 13, left broken and powerless. She ended life as the mother of a dynasty that ruled England for more than a century. She saw her son secure the crown. She saw him hold it through rebellion and conspiracy. She saw him establish a dynasty that led to Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Her triumph was not loud. It was quiet and enduring. It was built on endurance rather than brilliance. It was built on prayer rather than battle. It was built on the strength of a woman who refused to surrender. When she died in the year 1509, just days after the coronation of Henry VIII, she left behind a realm at peace and a dynasty strong. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey bears Latin words of honor, yet no inscription can carry the weight of her life. The true story of Margaret Beaufort is not only that she was the mother of a king, it is that she turned suffering into strategy, loss into legacy, and motherhood into monarchy. The triumph of Tudor was the triumph of her endurance.